So you know how whenever you are in a plane, you got the pilots up front, and you always want to fly with the pilots that aren't born again, because if they are born again and the rapture happens, the plane's going down. Well, the thing is, I'm not going to be there either, but it's going to be a disaster either way.
Wow, I thought that was going to be like a somewhat intellectually sound argument for pre-trib.
What are you talking about? That's exactly how it is in the Left Behind books.
It is.
That's exactly where I got most of my theology.
I don't understand why everyone else who believes in the Bible isn't post-trib, because it's the most scriptural. I mean, like, the Bible talks about us going through persecution. It's obviously going to happen. Post-trib is the only biblical way to
Why
think.
are you standing up and pacing? Sit back down.
I don't know.
Kyle can't even go there.
I can't even do it. I read every Left Behind book in succession, including the prequels, when I was a teenager. Man, I ate it up. Yeah, and I thought that was sound theology. That's clearly what's going to happen.
So as soon as I outgrew the Hardy Boys, Left Behind books were like the next best series. Loved it.
Yeah. I still feel a little queasy about Romanian people as a result.
Remember, it was Nicolae Carpathia, right? Yeah. That's the Antichrist, so just watch out for that one.
Nice.
Totally kidding.
Well, let's talk about eschatology.
Yeah.
That was the possible
We don't do that anymore.
No. All right. Kyle, you start us out on this one.
All right. Welcome to A Pastor and a Philosopher Walk into a Bar. Today we're talking about the end of the world.
Whoa.
If ever we needed a echo. That's right now. The end of the world. So some nerdy Christians like to call this eschatology, which just means the end of the world.
The study of the end of the world, yes.
Yeah, so...
you say so many nerdy things, and you're calling
right.
that nerdy?
I didn't say nerdy was bad.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, it's a good word. And so this is something lots of Christians have lots of opinions about.
Oh, man.
Yeah. It's in the creed, right? Creeds, I suppose, that
a little bit.
We're supposed to affirm a belief in...
the age to come.
Yeah. Looking forward to something happening. And the Bible has said some things about it that are, perhaps a nice way to put it is obscure. And some Christians have tried to make it clear. Just that when they try it, they don't agree with each other. So we're going to talk about lots of different ways to think about the end of the world and what our own views on it are and where they used to be and where they've come from and if this is important or not. And yeah.
But we can agree that Nicolas Cage is the best actor of our time.
Absolutely, yeah. I've still not seen. I just can't bring myself to watch the.
Why would you? No, can't do it. Have you watched the other version of Left Behind?
Yeah, the Kirk Cameron.
Woof, dude. Yeah. Ouch. Bad choice. I'm proud to say I've never seen a Kirk Cameron movie. Never.
Really?
No.
You got to watch Fireproof.
Nope.
That'd be good,
with
though.
With a bottle of whiskey.
See, I feel like that might be something for our Patreon audience. Would be the video of you guys watching Fireproof.
That's
well, no, we could do that with our top level, our top shelf Patreon supporters. We all watch Fireproof with a bottle of whiskey. Yeah. That'd be the only way I would agree to it.
Fireproof with a bottle of Fireball.
There you go. Fireproof with Fireball. It sells itself. It's amazing. I do remember I watched the God's Not Dead movie with a glass of whiskey and live tweeted it to get through it. This would be very much like that.
That's just shamelessly trying to get more Twitter followers.
Yeah,
I mean,
go find it.
I'm not gonna.
Speaking of bottles of whiskey, though, we've got a really interesting one in front of us. At least I hope it's interesting. We'll find out. So I'm a huge fan of Parks and Recreation. Are you guys fans of Parks and Recreation? Is anybody not?
Great TV.
I don't know.
Yeah, of course. I didn't know it was called Parks and Recreation. I thought it was Parks and Rec. My daughter told me that.
I suppose that's what everybody calls it. So everyone's favorite character on Parks and Rec is
Ron Swanson.
Ron Swanson. Yeah, played, of course, by Nick Offerman, who is kind of Ron Swanson-like in real life. If you watch him in other
Delightfully.
things or watch his stand-up, which I recommend. Yeah, and so in the show and in real life, he's a huge fan of Lagavulin Scotch, which is one of my wife and I's favorite distilleries in Scotland. So much so that the character in the show buys a share in Lagavulin, or buys a chunk of the company. But in real life, Nick Offerman is kind of a brand ambassador for them. So they have done a couple of special releases for him, and we're tasting the most recent one today. So this is an 11-year-old Islay Scotch, Islay Scotch, finished, interestingly, in Guinness casks. So
You didn't make a pleasant face when you said that.
Well, Guinness is not my favorite beer, but I'm intrigued, and I trust Mr. Offerman. So we're going to see how this goes.
You trust Mr. Offerman. Now, as a philosopher, why would you trust Mr. Offerman?
Because I've had other Lagavulin expressions, and they are delicious.
Oh, so it's evidence-based.
I suppose I trust Lagavulin, and since he likes them, I trust him as well. So we'll see. I'm not really sure what to expect here. We have had on the podcast one stout finished whiskey before. That was an Irish whiskey, and we liked it. So Scotch is superior in every way to Irish whiskey, so I can only imagine that this will be at least as good as that.
All right. Ooh. I mean, it's that big leather nose that you get with Scotch.
Lagavulin in particular has a very identifiable nose.
It's not an offensive peatiness, though. It's furniture, leather furniture, with some grain.
Oh yeah.
Definitely the kind of thing you want to sip in a library.
I can't smell at least the Guinness casks.
No, me neither.
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
Wow.
I get it a little bit on the end. It took a minute, though. Up until then, it was pretty much the standard 16-year Lagavulin, which is impressive being only 11 years old. But yeah, right on the end, I get a little bit of that stout.
Interesting. It seems like it's cut pretty low. It's not very hot.
Let's see, what is this? 46%.
I just want to say a first just happened. Elliot Lund did the Kentucky Chew. On the podcast, at least. I haven't noticed it.
I'm trying to figure this out.
Yeah.
It was my last resort.
For me, this is a very straightforward Scotch. It's got the peatiness, it's got the leathery, it's got the smoke, it's got a little bit of oak. It's got a little bit of citrus in it to me. Got that brightness to it that some Scotches don't have. I don't taste the Guinness casks, though, but I like this.
For me, it's just like a real quick, Tootsie Roll-esque finish. Doesn't last very long, but it's right there at the end. But yeah, otherwise, a very, it's Lagavulin. It's exactly what you'd expect from them. Peaty, smoky, easy drinking.
Yeah, easy
if
drinking.
You're into those things, which I definitely am. Kind of what you get in what you'd expect from Nick Offerman. No nonsense, straightforward Scotch.
It's like a dusty old attic. That's the smell for me. It's like if you poke your head into this attic, you're going to find some treasures in the boxes.
Nice.
It's delicious.
Yeah, I think your trust in Nick Offerman is well placed. Yeah.
Tastes like libertarianism.
Tastes like libertarian. Nope, take that out.
Tastes like gun stock.
There you go.
It's good. Well, thank you for the treat, Kyle.
Yeah.
Lagavulin.
I was lucky to get this. It's hard to find and it sells out fast in a local liquor store. Happened to have it, and I'm on their email list, so here we are.
Awesome. Thank you.
Love it.
Cheers.
Pause. Did you read through the stuff that I put about what Christians have thought about it? Is that boring or is it helpful or what?
We'll go through it, and if it's boring, we can cut it.
Cut it or speed it up like you did that time.
Philosophy stuff I just said.
Yeah, I'm gonna cut all of that.
It's gonna be a 17-minute.
I was thinking while I was saying it, I don't know if this is interesting.
All right.
It was interesting. It was just a bit brutal.
It was dark. It was very dark.
What
down.
so and so thought.
We might want to think about putting a little postscript on, after this one recording a little something a little bit brighter for it. It's pretty dark.
Yeah, I mean, all of our episodes aren't sad, but yeah.
Yeah. All right, you want to bring us back to eschatology and...
Yeah. So I remember the first time it occurred to me to doubt what I was taught about eschatology. A friend of mine, Shannon, maybe he's listening. I think he's a listener. A friend of mine and I were sitting in my room in this little house that I was renting a room in college. And we were both part of a ministry that had a very clear view of this. They were pre-trib millennialists. I'm sure some of our listeners are going to know what that means. We'll explain it in a few minutes. It's
like another language.
I know. It's ridiculous. But that was the view of the ministry that we were in, which meant we took for granted that there was a thing called a rapture. Mm-hmm. And so what this means is eventually, probably pretty soon, if you ask most of these people, there's going to be a time where Jesus comes literally on the clouds. Most of them think that he's going to be riding a horse. And he's going to come from the east, and the people, like in the Left Behind series, that are true believers, true followers of Jesus, true Christians, are going to be taken. And in the movies, what that looks like is their clothes crumple to the floor and their car just careens off the highway. You know, the people on the plane panic. And
we're talking east of North America here, right?
Right, yeah. The first people to see him will be on...
Trying to picture. Okay.
Yeah, somewhere in North Carolina.
It's a leftovers moment.
Because the people in the Northeast won't be looking. But we're laughing about it, but we took it seriously, believed it. And it occurred to my buddy and I that we'd never really dug into the scriptures. Mm-hmm. Just kind of took it for granted, so we were interested in, okay, well, where does the Bible teach this? Let's find it. And so we went digging, and there's one verse. I think it's in First Thessalonians or something. Don't quote me on that. But it's somewhere in there. One piddly little verse. And it took
about the rapture?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, to be fair to, pre-tribbers, Jesus talks about it in Matthew 24 as well. He doesn't use the word rapture, but he talks about two workers being in the field and one's taken away and the other's left, and, so on and so forth.
Yeah, but the one that they mostly focus on, right, is about...
First Thessalonians, yeah.
So maybe two, all right? And my friend and I were, looking into these, and we were reading around those verses in the chapters and trying to see if we could come up with alternative interpretations, and it was super easy to do so. And it just hit us kind of like a truck that, wow, this whole tradition is based on a pretty loose interpretation of this one or maybe two verses, and all of our friends are so sure about it. Mm-hmm. And so that kind of drove a wedge in our trust for that group we were in, and both of us continued that trajectory out of it eventually. But yeah, that stuck with me. This issue was one of the first to make me kind of alert to the fact that, gosh, all these religious people I'd just been believing my whole life kind of have some weak foundations for some of these views that they put so much stock in, because those views weren't just interesting things that might come out after a couple drinks at a party. These views dictated or determined how you voted.
Yeah.
And they determined your foreign policy. They still do for lots of Americans. I mean, we're right now in the midst of deteriorating, I suppose is a nice way to put it, relations between Israel and Palestine. And my family, all my friends, all the people in that church group had very clear views on how that should turn out.
Yeah. And
those views were based on, they were no more strongly supported by the text, I'll say, than that view of the rapture was.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I had to sort this out early in my spiritual journey, relatively early, because eschatology, end times theology, what have you, messed me up so bad. I mean, I grew up in a setting where, one of my parents had subscription to a pastor in New York who regularly would have prophecies about judgment or the end of the world and when it would happen. And I remember, I can still picture sitting on the edge of my parents' bed reading this newsletter that a parent told me to read and being scared out of my mind, thinking that this is all going to end in 3 years, and is this real? And I feel like I lived with that dread for most of my childhood and a lot of my youth. But in my youth, I quickly discovered kind of similarly to you, there's a different way of thinking. There's a different way of seeing the scriptures. Maybe this isn't as ironclad as I was led to believe. And that was the first thing that got undone about my theology, because I felt like I had to get to the bottom of it, because I was so full of fear about end times theology that I had to figure it out. And by no means do I think I've figured it out, but I walked away from that version that says the book of Revelation is this very clear, word that says exactly when and how things are going to happen and who the Antichrist is. And even though the Antichrist isn't really in the book of Revelation at all, that's in the first book of 1 John, but let's not think about that. So yeah, I mean, this one thing filled me with more fear, dread, kept me up at night as a kid and as a teenager than anything.
I mean, it is pretty terrifying.
Yeah.
Right? And it's usually based on like whether or not you go, whether or not you get taken, is as it was described to me anyway, based on beliefs that you hold. Not so much on what you do, although I suppose they would say the beliefs are supposed to result in some action, but whether or not you've kind of understood and signed on the dotted line about certain doctrinal views. So, there are pre-trib people who kind of have suspicions that the post-trib people might be left behind. And it doesn't matter that they, give to charity in their churches and raise good kids or whatever. It's belief-oriented mostly. And, as somebody struggling to figure out what they believed and who really felt like I had to be intellectually honest, that's scary.
Yeah.
Because I could find myself doubting, which seemed to be out of my control. And then if it happened then, well, screwed. And the story they tell about the few years after is not good.
No.
It's pretty dark. It's the stuff that allows Nicolas Cage movies to happen.
Yeah. Cheers to Nicolas Cage, by the way.
And his really terrible career that enables him to take these roles.
Well, I mean, The Rock, though. Like, we've still got The Rock.
Oh, my God. The only good Michael Bay movie.
Yeah, and the ironic thing is that we all felt so certain about these things. And I'm mostly putting a vicarious we because I was afraid of it, but it was given to me as such a certain ironclad, airtight argument. When you really just open the scriptures, it's just terrible exegesis. It's terrible biblical interpretation and reflection. It's terrible. So let's get into that a little bit and kind of unpack this thing and why we hold the views that we do now.
Yeah.
Okay, pause for a second. Where do we go from there? This probably isn't needed here.
No, I think we went through that. We defined
already did that.
Well enough already. Why is this not scrolling?
Because it's Google Docs and you gotta click on it. Okay. Do we want to do this?
Well, you just said we're going to get into why the exegesis is bad, so we should do that.
Okay. Go ahead.
That was your idea.
Okay, got it. So I want to think as we begin this conversation and get into a little bit of the nuts and bolts. We are not theologians. We are not biblical scholars. Let's just say that right off the bat. So don't expect any rich theology or deep biblical scholarship, because we're neither of those things. But we've thought about these things a lot and given ourselves to studying and trying to get to the bottom of it, which there is impossible. But I think this matters. I think this conversation really does matter. I was even thinking about this today. Like, should we have this conversation? Will people be interested in it? First of all, I think people are interested in it because we've been told something for our whole lives. And then when you think that you can pull the needle out of it, you can pull the rug out from underneath you, then it's what then and why? So I think for me it matters because all sorts of people within church history have done this poorly. And I don't mean a majority. There has been a lot within church history where they got this right. And it wasn't the Left Behind. It wasn't the Hal Lindsays of the world. It wasn't the, fire and brimstone preachers. Augustine was pretty smart about this, and we'll talk about that. But I think it matters for a couple of reasons. For me, one, because we need a better story within Christianity. We need a better story about where this is all headed.
Yeah.
Because who the heck is interested in the story that's been told that is it's all going to burn up and it's fire and brimstone and you're either sheep or goats and the beast is going to come out of the sea and who is that? Is it this, that, or the other politician? That's a terrible story, and it's taking metaphorical language in the Bible and apocalyptic literature in completely misunderstanding what apocalyptic literature is, completely misunderstanding how to get to the bottom of it, and just making these really simplistic, overly simplistic, damaging conclusions and feeding it to people and saying, this is our story of where this thing's all headed. That's a terrible story, and I want to change that. Like, I feel like responsible for that. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like, not like I'm going to do it myself, but we can do that a little bit together.
Yeah.
And then other podcasts, pastors, thinkers, followers of Christ can tell a better story that's more biblical and more hopeful.
Yeah. Yeah. And I care about it. I think this is important because, one, I mean, a kind of disappointing percentage of Americans are basing their foreign policy on this. So I was trying to find if there had been any empirical research on how many dispensationalists there are. We can define that term in a few minutes. That'll come up. The people that tend to believe in the rapture and certain views of Israel and whatnot, that dictates what they think America should do when it comes to the Israeli government bombing Palestinian neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of disappointing number of Americans base their views of that on these kind of hokey readings of the Bible that you're referring to. What you're calling poor exegesis is deciding how they vote.
Yeah,
that's
important.
Like,
it's like 1B to pro-life, right? Is your policy on Israel?
Yeah, and it's
and I'm not saying you can't be a Republican or conservative and be smart and intellectual and have good reasons for it.
Yeah.
But
and lots of Republicans are not dispensationalists or anything like that. But it's hard to find data. But I mean, of the people that self-identify as evangelical, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a huge voting bloc, like a quarter of the country, something like that. As of, I don't know, maybe like the most recent data I could find is like 15 years old, but like more than half of those people would answer affirmatively to the view that Israel fulfills biblical prophecy,
mm-hmm.
which is kind of a core dispensationalist
mm-hmm.
position. So,
mm-hmm.
I mean, this is like politically really important and current. So that's one reason I care about it. I also think it's important because it fundamentally alters your view of Jesus himself.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you think a certain way about how the world is going to wrap up, one very common story from these traditions that we both grew up in is that Jesus is fundamentally violent, or
mm-hmm.
in the end is
mm-hmm.
violent, right?
Yeah.
He preaches this good game about nonviolence, but like when it comes
push
right
comes to
down
shove.
to it, he comes back and murders everybody, right? And it's like super bloody in their reading of Revelation. And that changes your view of what God is like, which makes sense because, as we're going to see, the kind of theology that gives rise to these views wants to take the Old Testament very, very seriously and wants kind of to make the New Testament consistent with it rather
mm-hmm.
than the other way
mm-hmm.
around. And so being a person of nonviolence who tries to pursue that, it's important to me for that reason too, because it turns God into a bloodthirsty, vengeful entity that is unrecognizable to me.
Yeah. And we'll end this why does this matter on another very black and white blunt statement. Sorry. But another reason why I think this matters is because I'm sick of Christianity, large swaths of American Christianity, more closely resembling and choosing astrology over and above theology.
Ouch.
You know what I mean? Like, people obsessed about reading the tea leaves and the signs and this and that and the other.
I remember, see if I can remember how this went. This radio preacher that somebody I knew was really into for a while had this thing where, like, if you counted in the right way chapters of Daniel, and then you like went through mm-hmm. this like really precise, complicated mathematical mm-hmm. calculation, you could just determine something about our current political situation. And it was just, you're right. It's like numerology, astrology, mm-hmm. whatever. It's if you read a vague text with looking for something, you're going to find that thing.
Mm-hmm.
And boy, some of these people have perfected that kind of
thing. Oh boy, yep, intense. Yeah. Moving on. Do you want me to take this?
Yeah, sure.
And then you spice it, flavor it?
Yeah.
Okay. So go ahead and ask me, maybe.
Yeah. So, Randy, you know a bit more about this than me. I kind of had my, I guess, deconversion on this issue in college and haven't looked back too much since. I had a few, like a trajectory of views, but this is not something I've paid a lot of attention to recently. So, frame up for us what various kinds of Christians have thought about this. What has eschatology looked like in church history?
Well, a couple things. First, there's not many things that I know more about than you, Kyle, outside of sports, right?
And racing.
That falls under the umbrella of sports.
Does it?
That's a different episode for a different day. Also, I just want to say I'm not a church historian. I'm not qualified to give any authoritative lesson on what Christians have thought about eschatology or the end times. I've studied it. Basically, that's it. Right. So, I mean, the little I've learned is that the early church were still heavily influenced in their eschatology by ancient Jewish eschatology and apocalypticism. Right. So, when we read the New Testament, particularly when we read the Gospels, but also when we read Paul and John and all of the New Testament, we're reading guys who are still trying to figure this out.
Yeah.
Now that's a scary statement for some people who see the Bible a certain way, but these are guys who have been taught and groomed just like we just talked about how we were taught and groomed about what happens at the end of the world. They were given an eschatology, and that was rooted in their ancient Jewish worldview of the end times and what's going to happen. And so, as we read things like Matthew 24, or as we read things like 1 Thessalonians, like we've mentioned, we're talking about guys who are still working this out and trying to figure this out. So in the early church, it's very muddy, and there's all sorts of, really honestly, I would say, bad understanding and bad eschatology. It's because it's mixed up with a lot of things from their history. It's still synthesizing. So if you talk about what Origen thought about eschatology, he was a pretty good one. But there's a number of church fathers who had kind of weird eschatology because they're still trying to figure it out. Where things changed was with Augustine. Augustine in the 5th century, right, did all sorts of, I mean, he's probably the most famous theologian and most influential theologian in all of church history. And Augustine took all of these theories about end times and really like millennialists, people who thought that there was going to be this future time of 1,000 years where all is right in the world because Jesus will reign and all that stuff. That was a big, huge doctrine in the early church, and Augustine thought it was all silliness. And in The City of God, if you read it, he wrote about how basically there's the city of God, the kingdom of heaven, and the city of this world. The basically, we're gonna have to edit this out. What's the word I'm looking for? The terrestrial. Yeah. So there's a city of God and the kingdom of heaven, basically, in the city of this world, or this world, the terrestrial world. And that terrestrial world is always going to be flawed. It's always going to be broken. So don't ever try to hope for this 1,000-year reign of Christ when everything's going to be perfect. What we have to wait for is when Jesus, the second advent of Christ, when Jesus comes back and returns and judges the earth and makes all things right, new creation happens. And he was pretty insistent that no one knows. No one knows where, no one knows when, no one knows how, no one knows who is going to be saved in all of that business. But our job is just to be faithful.
Yeah.
I think that's a pretty good eschatology. And that once Augustine kind of laid that out, that ruled the day mostly in the church for the next many centuries, probably 7 or 8, 9 centuries. That was just normal eschatology in the church, pretty healthy. Along the course of those 7, 8, 9 centuries, there were the outliers who thought really crazy things and who believed all the post-trib, pre-trib, millennial stuff. And usually that was based upon world events that were happening, trying to make sense of things like Black Death in, I think, the 14th century, or trying to make sense of the 100-Year War, or trying to make sense of all this horrific stuff we see. And so they would take those things and say, well, this means that the 1,000-year reign of Christ is about to begin.
Which you can kind of understand, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, we just lived through probably the worst year collectively of any of our lives, right? You're a little older than me, but I suspect there hasn't been a 2020 in your lifetime or anything to really compare to that.
I mean, killer bees, right? Like, do you remember when that...
There's a hilarious meme I saw on Facebook that was just like frame after frame of like thing that just keeps happening, and you see it all kind of laid out all at once, not just the virus and not just the political stuff and not just the the social stuff, but all this random shit, like, freaks of nature and, things that are probably due to climate change. We had, I think, more hurricane, like named storms last year than any year ever.
Yeah.
And like stuff like that. And you can kind of see, I get it.
Yes,
I
absolutely.
understand why. I remember when I was growing up, every president was the Antichrist.
Yes.
Specifically the Democratic ones.
In your household.
But there was somebody, in my house. But there was somebody that was willing to say that every president was the Antichrist. What I thought was hilarious was when Trump was elected in 2016, who was, as far as I can tell, the most likely candidate we've ever had to actually be the Antichrist. And I'm basing that on the Left Behind series, by the way. No one.
Probably never
was
read
crickets, man. I didn't hear anybody claiming he was the Antichrist.
Oh,
I went
plenty
looking
of people
for
did.
it. The same people that were like ready to say it about every other president were dead silent.
Well, sure, of course, yeah.
I didn't hear a word. But I can get the motivation, right? Things are really bad. They've never been this bad before. We've got to be getting close to the end. What does my text say about this?
Yeah. I mean, going back into church history and what have the Christians thought about this? John Calvin had pretty good eschatology as well. He had quite good eschatology, and then his followers actually kind of twisted it a little bit when things started getting weird. Luther, I mean, the reformers were mostly good in their eschatology, except for Luther thinking that the Catholic Church was the Antichrist and the whore of Babylon, and the Pope was the beast out of the sea. Other than that, it was pretty solid.
Maybe a biased view.
Right.
With a grain of salt.
Where things went quite sideways for American Christians is, and not even just American Christians, Western Christians. Because this guy, I don't know if he was Irish or Scottish or English, but John Nelson Darby is kind of the father of dispensationalism, and that's when things got wonky, in my estimation. If you're listening and you're a dispensationalist, we love you, but you're going to get a little angry about this stuff coming up. But that's when things got weird and wonky, and the dispensationalism turned into, like you've been alluding to, Kyle, Zionism as well, which is weird. And then all of a sudden it turned into this horoscopy astrology, reading the tea leaves, when is it going to happen, and coming up with all these signs and, hints as to who's the Antichrist, who's the beast out of the sea, who's the whore of Babylon, all that stuff. And that's when things got funky. And then the 1970s happened, when pop culture eschatology happened. Yeah. And this guy by the name of Hal Lindsey wrote a book called The Late Great Planet Earth. And if you're old enough to live through the 70s, you know what I'm talking about. Or I'll bet your parents, if you're not old enough, I'll bet your parents, if they're evangelicals, good evangelicals, have a copy still sitting somewhere in a dusty location in their library. But The Late Great Planet Earth sold millions of copies and became basically functional eschatology for many Christians. And then, this movie in the 70s called The Thief in the Night happened. I watched it when I was in like freshman year of high school. And the art of it was just shockingly bad, but it was scary. It was for real scary, and that's what they were trying to do. And then if you're old enough, you remember the 90s, the Left Behind series, which you guys have been talking about. I had never read one of the books because I had already done the work at that point and realized that this is a bunch of garbage. But that was hugely formational for so many people our age in particular, but in the church in the 90s. And the crazy thing is that this eschatology, this end times theology, what we believe happens at the end of all things, was formed in the evangelical church in the last 30 years by a bunch of fiction writers. And I'm not exaggerating when I call them fictional writers. They're not theologians. They're not biblical scholars. They're just decent writers who tell a good story.
Or not so decent writers who tell a passable story. And make, movies that for some reason are successful. So we should also say that one way that this kind of seeped into the culture so that books and films like that could be really successful is that people like Darby and Schofield, who was a guy that followed him, were successful at getting their commentaries to the masses. So I remember when I just like first learned what commentaries were, like there are these aids that I can look to when I don't know what the Bible means. I can kind of look that part up and then read what this presumably more educated person had said about it. So I went digging around for free commentaries online. The first one you discover is likely to be Darby because it's so widely available. And, somebody that's really close to me had a Bible that was like gifted to him from a loved relative. And this was sort of the Bible that he was a baby Christian with, and so
Mm-hmm.
kind of learned faith from, and it was a Schofield reference
Yeah,
Bible, which
yeah.
meant that it's, first of all, choosing a translation that is easier to interpret in line with certain dispensational views, but also if there's ever a difficult passage to interpret, or if there's a passage that might possibly be referencing something about the future, well, there's a footnote there to tell you exactly what that means. And so for a brand new Christian reading a Bible like that, thinking this is just the faith, this is
Gospel
just
truth.
Christianity, yeah, it's easy to come away with the view that, well, okay, this is how we should read history, and this is how we should read the Bible, and it fits together in all these ways, and it gives me good reason to think that certain things are going to be happening in the future, and that it's relevant to my life and political systems and whatever. So, like, it seeped into the culture in the church before it then translated into popular culture.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it got so thickly ingrained starting in the 19th century, moving forward, particularly in the West, that you can't separate, in some ways, end times theology, and I would say poor end times theology, and Western Christianity, by and large. You can't separate the astrology feeling and the Zionism and the intensity of all of that without having nothing. It's almost like creationism for some wings of the branches of the church. If you take away this end times theology and this way of seeing the end of all things, what else do you have?
And there is a lot of overlap there, and I think they're like people in the same traditions tend to gravitate towards both of those things. And I think reasons for that include that there are certain ways of reading the Bible that are very literalist.
Yeah.
Right? That the Bible is supposed to be clear, and it's supposed to be understandable without having to try real hard, and to the average person.
Yeah.
And in these traditions, and so if it seems to me that it's saying that creation happened in 6 days, then that's what it means. And day must mean the same thing for me as it meant for the people that wrote it or whatever. And if it seems to me that Jesus is saying that, in the future he's going to come back on the clouds and take people into the air, well, that can't be a metaphor because God wouldn't lie to us, right?
Yep.
Why would he give us something hard to understand? And so that must be what it means. So this kind of
I get it.
literalism straddles that.
Yeah.
Both of those things.
Yeah. No, I get it. So let's think about what the Bible says about eschatology. Let's just try to...
Yeah, or it doesn't say.
Or doesn't say, right. I mean, there's all sorts of things that, again, is extra biblical that we've come to believe is gospel truth. But there are some things in the Bible about eschatology and end times that are, for somebody who holds the position that we would, are a little bit problematic. Let's just be honest. Like Matthew 24 is probably the biggest one for me. When you just go look through Matthew 24 and it's Jesus talking about what seems like the end times of this is how you know the end is coming, and there's nation against nation, and there's wars and rumors of wars. There's all these crises happening, and crises have been happening in every single decade of every single century of human history, right? And so that naturally people read those words of Jesus and they think this must be it, right? Yeah. We're in one of those moments. 2020 is not the worst year that's ever happened in the history of the world. Sorry to disappoint you, but there's been worse ones. But we're prone to saying this has got to be it. There's something here, right? So in Matthew 24, Jesus does say things like there's going to be two people working in a field. One will be taken, the other will be left behind, basically. There's a reason that the Left Behind series got so big is because Jesus said it. Yeah. He said things like, I will come like a thief in the night and you won't know the hour of the day. Now that part, a lot of these folks just leave behind and we want to know the hour in the day. But a thief in the night, we get that and it makes a good movie title. Yeah. So Matthew 24, though, there's this debate within biblical scholarship where some people really do think that Jesus was talking about the literal end of the world. Some people, other biblical scholars, think that Jesus was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 or CE 70. I don't know which one I should say now, AD or CE.
CE is the one the scholars use, but that means the same thing,
yeah.
So whatever.
So it's either about the end times or it's about the destruction of Jerusalem, which actually happened in AD 70.
Yeah. So this is like after I was a pre-trib, the rapture is going to happen, and then there's going to be this 1,000 years, and then Jesus is going to come back and kill everybody. Before, I transitioned into thinking, okay, well, maybe it's not maybe it's post, but this millennial thing is still in there. It's important that it's part of Revelation, right? There's going to be this 1,000-year reign of Christ, and it's important that we preserve that. And so I went through this litany of views, and eventually arrived at one called preterism, which is this idea that we should interpret passages like Matthew 24 to be about something that really has already happened, and it happened in the first century when Rome was burned, basically.
Jerusalem, yeah.
Jerusalem, and then Rome started to fall.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, all these, it's not that there aren't prophecies, it's that there are, and then they happened. The prophecies were accurate, and now we're kind of living in, you don't have to consider it a 1,000-year thing, but like we're living in the kingdom of God, and it's now our job to do something. So that I kind of gravitated towards a view like that.
Yeah, preterist is way better.
I've since left that behind too, but that's an option out there for people that might be wondering.
Yeah, and I say that, I mention these words and these phrases to say it's not crazy, I don't think, that to believe in Left Behind stuff. It's not crazy to believe in that Jesus, a Thief in the Night movie, the Rapture stuff. It's in the Bible, right? But this is like any other theological understanding. Is the Bible is a messy book. It's not clear, it's not easy, and it was written by guys who were trying to figure it out. And it's our job to not just grab that one little verse in Matthew 24, grab that one little verse in 1 Thessalonians, but to consider the whole narrative of the Scriptures. And when we're talking eschatology, more so the whole narrative of the New Testament, and say, what are the meta-narratives? What are the big themes that we see coming out over and over again that are the things that rise to the surface that we can put our faith in and say, this seems to be what Jesus is talking about. This seems to be what the New Testament, the writers of the New Testament, are trying to get us to understand. Yeah. And the book of Revelation is another huge one that I'm sure our listeners are like, when are you going to talk about the book of Revelation? The book of Revelation, I think, probably might be the most misunderstood book in the Bible. You can debate, there's other books in the Old Testament that are pretty misunderstood as well, but Revelation is right up there. Yeah. And we have to figure out what the book of Revelation is primarily about, firstly, right? Is the book of Revelation end times theology and predictions about what's going to happen at the end of the world and how Jesus is going to judge the world? Is that primarily? Or is it primarily a letter that was written to a persecuted church about calling into question where your allegiance lies, where your worship should be, and about empire, and about the ultimate victory of God and his kingdom, of the way of the Lamb? Which is it? It can't be both. One's a better understanding of Revelation than the other, I think.
Yeah. If you want to hear more about that, check out our interview with Brian Zahn. We kind of went a little deeper on that question. Sounds like you think the latter is probably the better kind of reading.
By far, yes.
Yeah, but the thing is, though, I remember when I was in middle school, we had like mandatory chapel services because I went to a Christian school, and they were just mind-numbingly dull even for a middle schooler. And so there were, of course, we met in a church, and so there were Bibles in the pews, and so I would just read the Bible while we were in these chapel services. And the most fun part of the Bible is Revelation, so that's what I read. I sat there and read, how old were you in 7th grade? I don't know.
About 13.
Okay, I was about a 12 or 13-year-old then. So
old enough that Song of Songs is the most interesting part of the Bible. I don't know what you're doing in Revelation.
Fine, fair enough. But I would sit and I'd literally read just this King James version of Revelation because, I'd absorbed what I'd been told about it, and it's dramatic. It's interesting. There's 4 horses, and they're bringing death, and it's it's amazing. It's like some of the most beautiful prose in the Bible, I think. But yeah. So obscure. Yeah. And so difficult to interpret.
I mean, and that's what apocalyptic literature is supposed to be, right? I mean, it made a lot more sense to the ancient readers and hearers of the first word of John's Revelation, but apocalyptic literature gets so misunderstood. I mean, apocalyptic literature. Can I just geek out just for a little bit?
Sure.
Yeah.
We'll cut it out if it's not good.
Yeah, good. Apocalyptic literature is not primarily basically a symbolic key code that we have to crack in order to figure out what's going to happen at the end of the world. That's not apocalyptic literature. The word apocalypse in the Greek literally just means to reveal, to uncover. It's an uncovering. It's an unveiling, right? And so the best way to think about apocalyptic literature, whether we're talking about the book of Daniel in the Old Testament or the book of Revelation, is basically apocalyptic literature is pulling the veil back on human history, on reality, to show the church, to show the people of God in a time of crisis what's actually happening within reality.
Yeah.
Did that make sense?
Yeah, but not in the sense that what's actually happening is, the president of this country is inhabited by a demonic spirit. Right. Not in that like really kind of hokey literalist sense, but in a more interesting political sense. Like there are these human tendencies that drive political systems, and we have some things to say about that as Christians, right?
Mm-hmm.
Jesus has some like stern warnings for certain ways of making decisions, and for certain ways of grasping at power in institutions. Like that's actually in the Bible, and so it's so ironic and sad when that stuff is instead interpreted as an unveiling of like individual personalities, so that we can like look out for who's actually on the side of Satan and who's actually on the side of. It's actually much more interesting than that, much more deep and complex than that.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the main reasons why we American Christians have such a hard time understanding the Bible, is because the Bible was written to and for primarily a marginalized people, in the Israelites and in the early church. And so when you look at apocalyptic literature, whether it's in the book of Daniel, when the Israelites were oppressed by the Babylonians first and then the Persians, or when you look at the book of Revelation where the church was being brutally persecuted by the Roman Empire, this apocalyptic literature is basically this message to the church to say, hey, check out what's really going on. I know it looks like these maniacal leaders who are slaughtering your family and friends and who are taking away your religious and cultural identity. It looks like they're going to win. But I want to pull the veil back a little bit and reveal to you what's really going to happen. And that is that Jesus, the slaughtered lamb, is going to win. And this kingdom, the real empire that will have no end is the kingdom of Christ, the kingdom of in the way of the slaughtered lamb. So be encouraged. This is what apocalyptic literature does. It encourages the people of God in times of crisis by showing them what's really going on within human history and where this thing is all headed, either in Daniel or Revelation.
Yeah.
That's totally different than what I was given with the book of Revelation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what you were given just totally missed the point, right? What we were given. Like, it's almost like Jesus tells a parable, and there's a character in the parable, and everybody after the parable is like, ooh, who's he talking about? Let's go figure out, was he talking about this political leader? Was it that political? Was it this guy? And so, like, one of the reasons I've moved past preterism is, like, even in that view, you're still trying to kind of locate the historical event that
Describe
passage is about.
preterism for us.
Yeah, just the prophecies about the end times were fulfilled in the first century with the destruction of Jerusalem and the eventual downfall of Rome, and then Jesus' kingdom inaugurated this new thing that the Bible just doesn't have much to say about. But even there, you're putting a lot of emphasis on the fact that, say, 666 and Revelation refers to Nero.
Mm-hmm.
Which is still kind of a personality thing. It's not false. Probably that's kind of who
the
authors had in mind, right? But at the end of the day, I don't think the point was Nero's evil. The point was the seeds of evil are in you. The villain of Revelation isn't Nero. It's me, right? It's the same tendencies that lead political systems today to persecute marginalized people. That happened in Nero, and it's happening now, and it's in my heart. And so, like, trying to pick out who's who in my current political environment is just totally missing the point.
Yeah. And I don't get accused, but people observe that on Sunday mornings, my preaching is a lot more large scale in nature. It's less individual, talking about individual sin, and more talking about systemic things. And the reason for that, and that's true. That is actually true. I talk more about communal things. I talk more about collective things. I talk more about systemic governmental things, And the reason for that is because this really formational literature in the Bible called apocalyptic literature is obsessed with systemic issues and with power and with empire and the ways of the empire and succumbing, not being glossed, or sorry. There you go.
He's been waiting.
Yep. Not being suckered into believing that the way of the empire is the way that's going to win. And that's what we do in the church. That's what the Israelites in the early church were suckered into thinking, that the way of empire, the way of violence, the way of dominance, the way of grabbing power, the way of greed, the way of manipulation is the way to achieve success and victory. Yeah. And apocalyptic literature is telling us that is actually the opposite of the way of victory, the way of success, the way of life. The way that we're supposed to walk is in the way of the slaughtered lamb. And that is why I get so obsessed with the systemic stuff. That's why I get so obsessed with the empirical stuff, because what's happening in the church in America right now is we believe that the way to accomplish Jesus' purposes and bring about the kingdom of God is through political power. And that is just so antithetical to the narrative of the scriptures.
Yeah, it's literally the thesis of the book. And hard to understand, obscure book,
Yes.
granted. But, I mean, yeah, that's almost certainly more in line with what he was actually getting at than what the dispensationalists thought. A guy I follow on Twitter named David Dark, who we should try to get on the show, likes to make people uncomfortable by saying things like the Bible is a critical race theory book, or that the idea started in the Bible, and I think a lot of what you're describing is evidence of that. I mean, we're not the first to think in institutional terms, and we're not the first to think of sin in institutional terms. Yeah.
So let's get at, while we're talking about the Book of Revelation, can we hit on a little bit of like what actually is going on primarily at the end of Revelation? And I'm thinking two things primarily. You brought up the violent bloodiness of, warrior Jesus in the end of Revelation.
Which, if you haven't seen it, Google SNL. What's it called?
I don't know. I don't know what you're talking about.
They did a skit on SNL. Oh, it was Jesus Unchained. Jesus spelled with a D, like the Tarantino movie. Pause this and watch that, and then come back.
I want to do that because I haven't seen Jesus Unchained. I don't think. That's amazing.
So good.
Wow.
We will have to watch it after that.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. Ask me some leading questions, Kyle.
Oh, so you're
not here, but about
what do you think of
what's happening in the bloody Jesus, and then where is this whole thing heading in Revelation?
So if Jesus isn't this guy that's going to come back with a sword and, fill the valley of Megiddo with blood or whatever.
Nice.
How do you read that stuff? How do you interpret how things are going to wrap up that's more consistent with what you see in other parts of the New Testament?
Mm-hmm. Well, first you have to zoom out a little bit and get an understanding of, first the word judgment is really good to understand. Revelation really is a book about, one of the main themes is judgment. But when I say judgment, I don't mean slaughtering millions of human beings who were disobedient to the way of Jesus. That's not what judgment is about. When you look at judgment in the New Testament, it's always about God setting the world to rights. Okay? That's just, when Jesus said in the Gospels, I have come to judge the world. It's not that Jesus said, I come with a flamethrower to burn up all the heathens. It's that I've come to set things right because things have gone wrong. So that's what judgment is primarily, first and foremost, in the book of Revelation, along with throughout the rest of the scriptures. Also, when you look at that bloody scene that everyone, the Mark Driscolls of the world love to just say this is what Jesus really is.
Yeah.
What we fail to recognize, first of all, is that Jesus, the Jesus of that Revelation 19, I think it is, he comes into the battle already bloody, right? Like before any blood has been shed, Jesus comes in with his robe and it's already been dipped in blood. And the thing is that it's not the blood of his enemies; it's his own blood. So there's huge.
Changes how you read that, doesn't it?
So there's like, okay, we got to reconsider this. And then when it talks about Jesus slaying his enemies, it's with a sword that's coming out of his mouth, right? And so that is metaphorically speaking to this reality that the Word of God is the thing that sets the world to rights. That Jesus is judging things with the word of it, the word that's coming out of his mouth. So it's this metaphorical sword that judgment is happening because of, and this all is happening because the Lamb has already been slaughtered. The victory has already been won. So this is this picture that we get. The blood that's shed in Revelation 19 happened before, and it's Jesus dipped in his own blood who's slaughtering his enemies. And his enemies are probably not actual human beings that he loves and created and died for, right? Let's keep the gospel in mind. His enemies are things like greed, injustice, oppression, racism, evil, violence, all of that. Jesus is setting the world to rights, and Jesus is overcoming them by the word, by his own death. He's overcoming all that's holding back humanity and all that's gone wrong within human history. That's what's being judged.
Yeah.
So that's a little snapshot of like, man, this looks really bad, but if we actually just look under the surface just a little bit, it's kind of beautiful, actually.
Yeah, I mean, if you think that it literally is, he's coming back to like kill the sinners and damn them.
Yeah.
Then you think Revelation and its authors are contradicting Paul.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Which I'm fine saying, but most of the people that take these views are not fine
No.
saying. Because Paul is very clear that it's not flesh and blood that we're
Yes.
fighting against.
Yes.
It's systems. He didn't use that
Yep.
word.
Powers and principalities.
But it's not a bad translation, right?
Yep.
Powers. He probably had Rome in mind.
Mm-hmm.
It's not individuals.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, go back to Revelation 4 and 5, when John gets beamed into the throne room, and he hears what sounds like a lion, and then he turns and he sees a lamb that's been slaughtered. That's the thing that the whole narrative is centered around, and how victory is accomplished is the lamb who is slaughtered has overcome.
Yeah.
This is central, the central vision of the book of Revelation. And then you get into the fun parts of, you go further into Revelation and you hear about where this is all heading, and it's not heading towards fire and brimstone and, gnashing of teeth. It's headed towards Jesus saying, "Behold, I am making all things new." It's headed towards the city whose gates will never shut, and all who will come may come. It's this invitation, this eternal, grand, beautiful invitation to new creation and resurrection. This is where it's all heading, towards Jesus making all things new, and that all things means all things. Mm-hmm. This is the story that we get in Revelation. This is why the book of Revelation is like a top 3 book for me.
Yeah. What else do we got here?
Can talk a little
What's
bit.
What's our time? Do we know what? Since we started this one.
Yeah, I'm not going to be able to look easily without stopping it.
Okay. Let me just put a little
from the
postscript
last
on
one.
that, and then we can go and should we just talk about these things? Like this, I think we can take out because we can talk about what's a better way there.
Yeah. So I think we just answered this.
Yeah, I just want to postscript. The stuff that you see in the book of Revelation, primarily in Revelation 20 as well, about the disobedient and the vile and the ungodly going away to misery, I think all of us are going to have to face that in some way, shape, or form. Like the judgment of God, setting the world to rights, happens to me personally as well, I believe. I don't think any of us get out of the fiery, all-consuming fire of the love of God that will burn away and purify all that is not of the way of agape love. And so I really think all of us will face that fiery judgment of the love of God. It's just that for some of us, it might last a little bit longer than the others, and it's going to take a little bit more fire and pain to burn off that brokenness and that ugliness of evil and violence and the ways of the world than for others. But I think all of us should fear that. I think that is real.
Yeah.
For those who are saying, well, but that's in there too. Yep. That's real.
Yeah.
And I think all of us should have a healthy fear of God about that, because the fiery love of God will not tolerate any selfishness, wickedness, evil, violence, you name it.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember trying as an undergraduate to figure out what is this fear of God thing that certain parts of the Bible seem to be really in favor of.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of Christians seem to be really in favor of, but then other parts of the Bible seem to maybe be in tension with, know, perfect love casts out fear. Fear is like a bad thing, And that's kind of what I came to, is that, yeah, it's a fearful thing to recognize that God's nature is pure love, because mine isn't, and that one of my academic mentors writes about the severity of God, in the sense of, to be in relationship with God, in the Christian tradition anyway, in the Jewish one, is to have moral demands placed on you. It's to have a person on the other side of your conscience. And that can be really scary, to know that when I make a selfish decision, or when I don't know, assume that because someone is different from me that they're therefore lesser, that this is something God will not tolerate,
Mm-hmm.
and that my existence depends on overcoming that. Because I'm also part of my trajectory out of this kind of thing was towards a view called annihilationism, which I think is also your view. I'm assuming that maybe it's
No.
not.
It used to be.
We should talk
Used
about
to
that. But the idea that if my existence is owed to God, my being is sustained by God, then my continual rejection of God will ultimately entail my non-existence. And so if I can't ethically get there, then I just stop being, and that's pretty scary,
Yeah.
So that's fear-inducing, but not in a way that God is like angry or judgmental or anything like that.
Yeah. All right, we could talk about resurrection, but I feel like we have in some ways. We could talk about what we actually think about it, and then what takeaways are.
Sure.
Yeah, seems like that's the way to go with it.
We've said enough about resurrection, you think?
I think so.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And that'll come out in what we think about it, because that's so. Go ahead, Elliot.
So it's a lot of talk about how we think about all of these things, but I'm really curious, just like to concretely get down to it. Randy, what do you think? Kyle, what do you think? I'd love to hear just how you think about this now and have evolved in your views.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, Kyle?
Yeah. So in talking about the episode before recording it, you, Elliot, said I'm in the don't really give a flip category anymore. I understand that. I'm psychologically kind of there as well. I don't think that whether or not you think there's a 1,000-year reign in our future makes a huge difference. It does, except insofar as it makes a difference in how you vote or in the kinds of social policies you're willing to support now. If it starts to creep into that, then I'm interested. And let's have a conversation about it, and I'll try to convince you otherwise. But as far as, is there any actual prophecy in the Bible? Because that's kind of a question that's bound up with this. Prophecy in the futuristic sense, not in the sense of speaking to power, because that's obviously in the Bible. But, is there anything in the Bible that predicts something that's going to happen? I tend to think not, but I also tend to think it doesn't really matter. Except insofar as you let that influence your ethics and your politics. And a lot of people do, right? So I think this is where I kind of end up on all these things we talk about on the podcast. If you can believe those things, like say you think there's a genuine prophecy in the Bible that will be fulfilled at some time in the future, we can have fellowship together, and I can respect your view insofar as you have some humility about it, and you recognize that it doesn't entail that you need to vote for a politician who's going to support the current state of Israel, because that implies a kind of confidence that I think just isn't possible given the evidence that we have. So personally, I just don't care, except insofar as it impacts things I do care about.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, for me, eschatology all boils down to one word, and that's resurrection. You could add two more in there, new creation. But those are the things that I think we are headed towards. Those are the things that all of humanity, all of reality is headed towards, is restoration, redemption, new creation. And I think I get that from the scriptures. I get that from the Apostle Paul in Romans 8 saying that all of creation groans like in childbirth for the sons of God to be revealed. You can get that from the Apostle Paul in, I think, Romans 6, talking about how we've been united with Christ in his death, how much more in his resurrection. And then you could go out through the book of Revelation, and it talks about new creation and restoration and redemption and resurrection. So that, for me, is a more scriptural story, and it's a better story. It's a way more hopeful story that I think the Eastern Orthodox tradition has gotten way better at than the Western Church, to be honest with you, throughout church history. And if you're interested in this stuff, if you're wanting to kind of maybe work through your thoughts on the book of Revelation and eschatology, end times things, primarily rooted out of the book of Revelation, I'm going to recommend that you go and pick up at your local bookstore or Amazon, Reading Revelation Responsibly by Michael Gorman. Reading Revelation Responsibly by Michael Gorman. It's, I think, the best work, and it's short. It's not academic. It's written by an academic, and it's brilliant. And it talks through what these sequences of bowls and trumpets and cups are in the book of
Yeah.
Revelation, and it works through all the metaphors and symbolism and what it's really about. So,
Yeah.
but I believe that resurrection and ultimate restoration is where this whole thing is headed, and I think that that's scriptural. I think the Apostle Paul would agree with me, because he wrote something like, nothing will separate us from the love of God, not heights, nor depths, nor width, nor, nor death, nor any other thing can separate us from the love of God in Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
I take him by his word on that. And that's where I think this is all headed, and that's where I think we should be thinking about when we talk about eschatology and end times. Will there be tribulation and hard times? I don't know. I think we're going through hard times right now. We're going through intense things that feels fiery and feels difficult and painful and heart-wrenching. And our job is to make sure that our allegiance and obedience and worship and all of us belong to the Lamb of God, the slaughtered Lamb.
Yeah. We'll put that book in the show notes.
Good, yeah. So you're gonna have to chop this up a lot, but so I think listeners, we don't want to tell you. We're not in the practice of telling you what to think, right? I don't want to tell you, like, well, Pastor and Philosopher said it in the bar, walked into a bar, said it, or Kyle said it, or Randy said it. So I'm just gonna walk away and think that. Do the work yourself. Read the books and have these conversations with friends, and email us if you want, and let's get a conversation going. But I want to encourage you. There's a better story than the one that many of us have been given, and there's a more scriptural way of understanding these complex things, and it is complex and it's difficult to navigate. But I believe scriptures tell us that this is all headed somewhere good. Yeah. I just want to pause there for a second. In the reality in the year that we've just had, and the year and a half that we're still in, and that we're still trying to figure things out, my life has been disoriented in intense ways. But what gets me through it currently right now, all of the disorientation and pain and uncertainty, is resurrection. Is what I believe is real, that this is all headed somewhere good. That's a story that the church should be telling.
Yeah, one of the things that gives me a lot of encouragement, despite all the things that I've questioned and doubted and given up on, is the hope that when it says that Jesus endured the cross because of the joy that was in store, the hope that that's true, and that God wouldn't incarnate if not for a good and ultimately successful end. Can't say I'm certain about that, but it's encouraging. It's a marked difference from what I used to think, which is that Jesus did it for what ultimately turns out to be vengeance. That doesn't appeal to me anymore.
Yeah.
That's susceptible to all sorts of critiques from people like Nietzsche and others. So now the idea that what I'm enduring now, what we've endured as a species, that what's going to bring Jesus back is the same thing that brought him the first time, which is beauty, love, community, not ugliness and vengeance and judgment.
Yeah. Yeah, and the judgment is reserved for the evil and the broken ways of this world that has plagued humanity. It's not reserved primarily for human beings who Jesus died for. You have to reconcile that. Either Jesus died for these human beings to have life and to save them from all of that, or Jesus is going to kill them and let them suffer eternally. Those two things don't jive so well, I don't think.